Title of this presentation is in Monolingual Multiculturalism, African Theology Eats Western Theology. I want to articulate something obvious, yet that is rarely realized. To make my case, I'll simplify by assuming that there's two theologies, Western and African. This simplification enhances the clarity of my argument without compromising on its truth. The difference between the theologies arises largely from the or vastly different contextual, psychological, philosophical, historical, and other suppositions underlying the alternative uses of language, in this case, like African languages as against English. In my study here, I assume, as is almost universally the case today, in order to point to today's problems, the language of intercultural engagement to be English. Now, African theology or theologies are rooted in African traditional religion, culture, philosophies, and so on. Now, this is for at least three reasons beyond critique. Reason one, to criticize the African is to be racist. Reason two, African truths being in African languages largely either disappear from the view of Europeans or are distorted when expressed using English. Number three, Africans are secretive of their understandings. African worldviews, values, and so on are the water Africans swim in. They do not articulate them, they simply presuppose them. To articulate them would require non-Africans. This articulation being actively discouraged, African ways continue hidden. Now, Western truth is of a very different nature. Whereas Africans conceal their thinking, Western people frequently try by all means, often publicly, to articulate it. So millions have in the past and continue today to express it and spread it as widely as possible. That is in books, films, the media, videos, podcasts, discussions, educational systems, universities, conversations on the bus, emails and blogs, and so on. When Westerners express themselves, now also they do so in their own language, the contours of which, i.e. the categories assumed in the language and so on, tally with their own thinking. The West for many is clearly, these things in the West are an outcome of biblical faith. So the West has a tradition which values criticism. Many Westerners want to respond to criticisms of them that arise from outside of the West. That to them is how to not be ethnocentric. They endeavour to listen carefully, not realizing that they cannot understand what African and other foreign people say without grasping that foreign way of life. Then at times under pressure, they'll even change what they do and believe. They won't change this because they're prompted to do so logically, emotionally, or even from revelation, but because classically, another, often oppressed people encourage them to do so, and they don't like to see themselves as oppressors. So then we get today's contrast. African beliefs and cultures, only Africans know them. They often can't anyway, and are not permitted to, or they be racist against themselves, articulate them. Yet, many Africans feel them. As a result, for them, Western discourse, including Western theological discourse, seems to fall short. So they criticize the West, often being encouraged to do so by the West itself. The basis from which they criticize remains hidden, but the criticism has to be accepted as being legitimate. Now, Western beliefs, everyone knows them. They articulate at great volume in intricate detail in increasingly accessible ways. To assume someone to not have them is to be racist. Because one cannot tell what African beliefs fall short, they're invisible and so immune to criticism, so all the formal criticism is one way of the West. Now, the West can propose things for Africa, like its educational system, but it may not criticize what is African. Westerners typically do not realize what is happening. They seem to be correct to, even morally obliged, don't be ethnocentric. to permit challenges by others of their beliefs. They overtly shift their beliefs, here we're looking at theological beliefs, in order to accommodate multicultural inputs. Yet the impact of Africa and much other foreign, Islamic, Buddhist, communist and so on, criticism is an undermining of good sense in the West. Thus, multiculturalism acts to destroy the foundations on which the West is built, on which immigrants, frankly, these days also want to build. In short, multiculturalism destroys. Okay, so what ought to change? An important change needed is attention to the direction of translation. In other words, foreigners who happen to have learned one's language but have a minimal grasp of one's cultural presuppositions, I suggest, are not well positioned to deeply critique what one believes and does. Allowing one's practices to change in response to critique by such foreigners unfortunately is asking for trouble. Articulations of foreign people must connect indigenously. For example, if the West wants to learn from African theology, Westerners should learn African theology in situ in Africa using an African language. Then those Westerners may be equipped with care to provide some healthy critique to Western theology. This is bringing African theology into an indigenous Western context. Similarly, it also applies. If the African wants to learn from Western theology, it should be from Africans who have experienced through English of Western theology, who then go back to Africa to enlighten their own people using their own African languages. I suggest it's vitally important to recognize and appropriately respond to the problems I'm here identifying. So yes, Africa can learn from the West. If they want to do so in a healthy way, they should articulate their theology in their own languages. They would argue then theologically with each other. If this process is continued over an extended period and a sufficiently large population, then a literature in African languages will be built up. If the population drawing on that theology lives admirable lives, they'll be revered, and others will want to explore the theology that underlies those lives. So enterprising, inquisitive, intrepid Westerners will travel to Africa to immerse themselves in the culture and read the books and listen to the theologians, then report back home. African theology as a legitimate, recognizable, not theolophagous discipline in the West will have been born.